is Barry here from the Brewed Palate. I'm here with Patrick Fondiller from the Smuttynose Brewery, the New York Brewing rep for one of my favorite breweries. I was actually telling him that Smuttynose IPA was my first ever craft IPA, and now it's one of my go-tos at local bars. So can you just tell us a little bit of your history with Smuttynose? I've seen you around the scene for quite a while. And what's your experience been with Smuttynose in the city?
I started working for Smutty about almost going on 4 years. Before that, I worked for the Gate in Brooklyn, which you may or may not
I've been there before.
Same ownership group as the Blind Tiger in Manhattan. So I started working at the Gate in 1999, which is right around the beginning of
the craft beer revolution.
Craft beer revolution in New York City. I mean, not all over the place, but here. It was pretty much the original beer bar in New York, or in Brooklyn rather. Opened the same time as the Blind Tiger did. Yeah. And I was there for about 12 years. And I have a daughter who's 4 years old. When she was born, I decided that I needed to get out of the bar and get a job that was more amenable to getting home on time. And so I threw my hat in the ring for a supplier job and literally made a list of the 5 breweries that I wanted to work for, and Smuttynose was my #1 choice.
Alright, so how has it been? Like, what's the acceptance of Smuttynose in New York City specifically? And I know I drink their beers, but I don't know what other craft beer fans, in terms of Smuttynose. So what's your experience been with,
New York has been very receptive for us. As of last year, Union Beer, who's our wholesaler here in New York City, became our biggest wholesaler in the country.
Wow.
And then they wound up splitting off into 2 separate divisions, so now that's not the case anymore. All the counties in New York that are Westchester and above are now with a different wholesaler that's owned by the same group. But when I took over working for Smuttynose, Union Beer was our 4th biggest wholesaler, and then they were the biggest. So we sell a lot of beer here. The reception has been great, I'm looking forward to this year, especially because we have a brand new brewery going online next month.
I've been watching all the videos they're posting online. So can you just tell us a little bit about what led up to building the new brewery, where it is, and what's going to be coming in now that you have a much bigger brewery?
Well, there was a lot that went into it. I mean, this is a process that's now in its 7th year, I believe. Peter Eggleston, who's the owner and founder of Smutty, decided that he was going to start looking for a spot to open a new brewery, and we actually went through the process on 2 different properties up in New Hampshire and Portsmouth, which is where we're currently located. And for one reason or another, they just didn't work out, and then finally settled on a place called Towel Farm in Hampton Beach, which is about 20 minutes from our current facility. And they signed a lease on that place, and we broke ground about 14 months ago. And we should go online. The brew house is being installed as we speak.
Yeah, I saw a video.
And it's a brand new state-of-the-art brew house. We should start brewing there next month, like I said, hopefully.
And is the older brewery gonna you're gonna stay there in the older brewery for R&D, or do you move totally to the new one?
As it stands now, our hope is that we would somehow be able to hold on to it, but I'm not sure if that's going to be feasible. In the interim, we do have the luxury of being able to brew there while we're getting the new brewery online, so that's a good thing.
Right.
There have been several different options that have been bandied about, one of which is to actually hold on to the old brewery and try and set up a barrel aging kind of more higher end brewery. And as it stands now, we've been doing over the course of the years big beer series, and then we've been doing a short batch series, which are 30 barrel batch kind of more high end rarer beers. And we just put the first beer out under a label called Smut Labs, which is I guess kind of the hope going forward that we can have a wholly separate label called Smut Labs coming out of that facility, similar to what Lost Abbey is to Pizza Port.
Right. So, I mean, you guys have a pretty big, portfolio of beers, between the year-round beers and the seasonal beers and the big beer series. But like, what is Smuttynose like overall philosophy about the beers that they brew? Like, what do they, what's their philosophy and like what they bring to the craft beer scene?
I think Peter and Dave Yarrington, who's our director of brewing operations, Peter's biggest thing, especially, and Dave, has always been to put out the highest quality beer that we're able to, and obviously, the equipment that you have, puts certain limitations on that, especially when it comes to bottling. But this new facility should take care of those issues. Right now they have to do a lot of extra work to ensure the quality of the beer as it gets out into the market. But the brew house that's going in is Krohn's, is the German company that built the brew house. It's Steinecker Combi Cube system, which is the same exact system that Founders Brewing Company uses. And we also bought a brand new Cosme bottling system from Krohn's Italian division. It's quality. That's our biggest thing. So in the last I checked, I think 2011, Smuttynose was the 28th ranked American brewery in the country, which puts us in the top 3% of breweries in the world that they have rated, which are about 10,000.
That's great.
So that's pretty awesome. And I just know that once we do start brewing on the new system, it's going to go.
I mean, it has seemed to me, at least the past few years, that you've been like trying to gear up towards moving somewhere else because you've been releasing like, more barrel aged stuff, more like small batch stuff, just to show people that that you're always pushing the boundaries.
Yeah, I mean, we've always kind of done that stuff, but very little of that beer until now has gotten out of New Hampshire or even Massachusetts. We kind of allocate the beer based on either super special events that are taking place in the places that we are available, or to the places where we sell the most beer, which has always been New Hampshire and Massachusetts.
I mean, I've seen some of the special releases on tap in New York also.
Yeah, well, we're soon. We invested in a machine that we can do cork and cage finishes.
Mm-hmm.
So we've started putting small amounts of what we were calling the short batch series in the 750s with cork and cage, but they had the punch labels.
Mm-hmm.
I think there were about, just off the top of my head, I think there were about 10 of them. And now we're going into the Smut Labs label. So the very first Smut Labs beer came out, and they're in 375s with cork and cage. It's called Pure Biss, and it's a beer that we did as a collaboration with Chef Jamie Bissonette, who owns a restaurant called Toro here in New York City and also in Boston. And it's a saison that was made with kaffir lime leaves, grapefruit zest, and spruce tips, and a little bit of sterling hops. For the most part, it's a brew. It's the flavoring is all coming from these weird other ingredients that they put in there. And I just got word today actually that I'm getting 10 cases for the market. So initially, when we made the beer, we made it all for Jamie's restaurants. And they took the bulk of it, but it looks like there's a little bit extra. So there may be, I think, about 10 cases coming into the market. So yeah, that's going to go into places like your Beer Crafts and City Swiggers and Good Beers of the world. But there's so little of it that it's going to be one of those things where all the beer geeks are freaking out about it.
It's definitely a good mark, a good accolade for a brewery to feel good that you have beers like that beer geeks will run after.
Well, we know this from experience because we have Kate the Great, or had, which was made at Portsmouth, which is the original
Right.
business before.
This is where my T-shirt is from.
I didn't
Yeah,
notice
I was
that.
there a couple years ago.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So yeah, the Kate the Great phenomena was like really crazy for us. I mean, if you couldn't even, I mean, the whole town of Portsmouth basically shut down every year when we released this beer. And I've always had the feeling that a lot of these things are totally overhyped.
Right.
I mean, personally, we make an Imperial Stout, which is coming into the market. It's part of our Big Beer series. It has a perfect rating on the rating websites from the Beer Geeks, but I've always felt that it was a better beer. I mean, Kate the Great is a great beer if you get it on Kate Day in the Portsmouth Brewery, but when they bottle it, it wasn't bottle conditioned, so it didn't hold up very well. I feel like a lot of those things are just like, it's crazy hype.
So, like, one last question before we get into the tasting of some of Smuttynose great beers. What's the exact relationship between Smuttynose and Portsmouth? Like, how does it work? Like, that's your like brew pub, and then you have the production brewery. Like, how do you?
Well, here's how the whole thing started. So, back in the '80s, Peter Eggleston, who's the founder of Smuttynose, was a high school English teacher at Sarah J. Hale here in New York City in Brooklyn. And his sister Janet started the Northampton Brew Pub, which is now the oldest continually operating brewery in the country. And she needed some help up at the brewery, so she asked Peter if he would come up and work with her. And he left his job as an English teacher and went up and became the brewmaster in Northampton. This is in 1986. So this is 2 years after Sam Adams started. And this is right at the beginning of craft beer. I mean, it's one of the oldest, as I said, continually operating businesses in this business. And then a few years later, they opened the Portsmouth Brewery in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, which is a brew pub. And then a few years after that, Peter placed a lowball bid on the old Frank Jones Brewery, which is a production facility in Portsmouth that had gone up for auction, and won, and was like, okay, now I own a brewery. That's how Smuttynose was started. The name comes from an island that's off the coast of Portsmouth in the Isles of Shoals, which is where our pale ale name comes from. Smuttynose is one of the islands in the archipelago of islands right off the coast of the state.
So what's the relationship nowadays? Like, it seems like sometimes like that everyone knows they're like brother and sister breweries, but like, do the brewers collaborate? Do the Smuttynose brewers go to Portsmouth and brew like small batches?
Yeah, for a long time, somewhere along the line, Janet and Peter separated their business entities. So Janet owns in whole Northampton, and then Peter's life partner Joanne Francis, who designs all our labels, own Smuttynose and Portsmouth. And yes, they're owned by the same people, but they're separate business entities. But there is collaboration that goes back and forth. For a long time we had Todd Mott as the brewmaster at Portsmouth, and Todd recently left to pursue his own interest, which is a cidery up in Maine. I don't know if he's gotten that off the ground yet or not. And we hired one of his assistants as the head brewer at Portsmouth. And I know that Dave Yarrington, our director of brewing operations, definitely consults with him. But the beers themselves are totally separate entities. And we did do a collaboration actually at Portsmouth with Stone Brewing Company. So it was Todd Mott and Mitch Steele and Dave Yarrington doing a beer called Cluster's Last Stand, which was based on the old just post-prohibition Ballantine IPA recipe. And Ballantine was a brewery in Jersey, in Newark. And right after Prohibition was repealed, they made an IPA that was a pretty high ABV IPA that Mitch Steele had researched for his book, on IPAs, and he was up at the brewery one time joking around with our brewers about, they were telling him that they want to make a beer called Cluster's Last Stand and use all the hop varieties that nobody uses anymore, and he thought it was hilarious. So he writes about it. There's a little bit about it in the book, and then a few years later they got together and actually decided to do the beer. So they did the first batch at Portsmouth, and it wasn't, Portsmouth doesn't distribute, so it wasn't allowed to leave the state. And then we talked to them about doing another batch at Smutty so that we could distribute it more widely. And Greg Cook from Stone came out to Smutty, and we brewed a second batch of the beer there and then bottled it. You may have seen some of that around in the city, and then we have a third batch coming soon.
Awesome. So now we've thrown all this information at you, let's go in and taste some of Smuttynose' greatest beers.